Welcome to Echo Zulu Cruising. Today we're going to be talking about a 10-day or so boat trip, week to 10 days on a powerboat, kind of the steps to doing that. So if you're looking to go on a 10-day trip or a week-long trip out on a boat, this is the video for you, the planning and some of the process up front to make it a really enjoyable trip on the back end when you're out on the water. So I'm Dave. I'm a former boat captain. I worked in the Florida Keys and the Bahamas back in my youth before taking desk jobs and really not spending as much time on the water for a really long time. My wife and I are learning and relearning a lot about boating, and we're trying to share that process that we're going through. I come from this perspective of knowing what I don't know, knowing I'm having to relearn things. Either technology is different or there's things I know I should be able to do, but I just don't remember the process. So trying to share those, make boating accessible and fun, because it's really all about enjoying the water. And my wife and I love doing that, and we want to make sure other people have the opportunity to do that, because just being on the water is one of the greatest things in the world. So we're going to discuss the general steps. It's about 10 steps, or it is 10 steps that we have laid out for making a plan for that boat trip. We're also going to use examples on our Jeanneau NC 1095 Sweetest Thing, kind of how we prep them. So the broad concept, and then sometimes how we execute that on our boat to give some perspective on that. We're going to show some of the apps that we use, some of the paperwork that we use, and some of our thinking that goes into these longer trips. So come along, let's start planning some trips and get ready for boating season. Step one is really knowing your boat. You have to know your boat kind of inside and out, your range, your speed, your fuel capacities, your draft. You want to know your boat so that when you're starting to make your plan, you know what's going to be within the capabilities of your vessel. You're going to need to know your boat's length, the beam, the draft, and the air draft. For marinas, they're often going to judge you by your length and your beam, and then draft and air draft are really important for your kind of process, your route. What happens with bridges? Where can you go based on how much water you draw? You're going to want to know your power options. Do you have a generator? How much power cords do you have? How long do your batteries last? Those are all going to define how long you're going to be away from the dock, how long you're going to be able to be out, what your options are for staying out, anchoring out away from power sources. In our case, we also need to know propane. So we need to know if we have a full propane tank or not, because that's what we use for cooking. You want to know your ground tackle or anchoring. So how much line do you have? How much rode do you have? How deep can you anchor is really what that's telling you. That's going to give you the options for anchorages. And you're going to want to have extra fenders and lines because you're going to be in marinas that you don't know potentially. So you want to have options open when you're in those foreign marinas. Make sure you have all the extra lines and fenders so that you can figure out how you're going to dock when you go into a new marina. Whether you have a dinghy or not also is an important point. That's going to determine what kind of activities you can do, what kind of mooring you can have. Can you anchor, or can you anchor and not go ashore? And of course, you need to know how much storage you have for food and perishables. So that's another real important definitional point. That's going to be how long can you be away from a dock. It's going to be determined by your storage. On Sweetest Thing, our Jeanneau NC 1095, the Mary Fisher, the range is about 190 nautical miles at 25 knots. So with 10% in reserve, we can go about 190 nautical miles. Basic rule of thumb for powerboat range is offshore, it's 1/3 of fuel out, 1/3 of fuel back, and then 1/3 in reserve. When you're going along the coast, you can go point to point more and have a smaller reserve. We normally have 10 to 20% that we want to end up with, and really it's normally closer to 20 that we'll end a day with. For marinas and bridges, the Mary Fisher 1095, it's 35-foot boat. It's about 11-foot beam. So that gives us what kind of marina space can we be in. And we draw 3.5 feet with an air draft of about 13 feet. So just over a meter is our draft. And what would that be? Close to 4 meters is our air draft. Knowing that helps us understand what's the route we can go, where can we go, and also what kind of anchorages are going to be available to us based on what we draw. We have shore power, either one 50 amp service or two 30 amp service. Either one works for us. We have a generator that provides up to about 18 hours of power on board. that with the AC running, the lights and everything running. So we also need to plan for the diesel for that generator. But that allows us to be out, if we're running with the AC 18 hours straight. Obviously, if it's not running all the time, we can go a lot longer without running the AC. And we have a propane stove. That propane stove is kind of, it defines how much we can cook. We have about 20 meals out of it. We haven't gotten to the top limit. We've filled by 20. So that's, knowing how many meals you have also helps part of that planning process. We have 2 small refrigerators on board, which is almost decadent for 2 people. We have a lot of fresh food, a lot of storage for that. We also have a dinghy on board, a Taka Cat with an e-propulsion engine. Really enjoy that. It's a great dinghy to have on board. Allows us to explore, and it allows us to go into shore if we're moored out or anchored out. And you know, it's something on our boat. We have a smaller boat. It's not always on board. We inflate it for a trip. We have it on a roof rack and pull it in the water and install the engine when we're on point. So it's not something where we have a lift for it. We store it on the roof rack and then pull it down. And then for us, we also have to plan on the fuel. Going about 200 miles costs about $1,100 depending on fuel prices. So that's one of our kind of planning factors, how much we want to spend on fuel based on where we go. So we're always thinking about what's the cost benefit of part of the trip. Now, noting all these parameters, that gives you the good sense of, you know, what can you do? What do you want to do? What's the range? What's the distance? What's the type of marinas you have? How many nights can you be out? Knowing your boat is the foundational part of trip planning. It's not where you want to go first. It's what can your boat do first. So step 1, know your boat. Step 2, that's when you decide on your route. What's in the parameters of your boat? How far do you want to go each day? What's a comfortable range for you, your passengers, in terms of how long you want to be running? How far do you want to go? How much do you want to spend? And do you have an ultimate goal of getting to a location, traveling more some days and less other days? Thinking through that route for the time you have is really important. When we're starting to think about a route, we're going to use kind of a range of tools that are at our disposal. Some of that is the handy dandy waterway guide. The waterway guide's one of our absolute favorite tools. It gives a lot of information and direction. We have our charts, which I always like to look at the overall chart, because charts just give a different feeling for me of the overall trip, even though I may not use them all the time when we have the chart plotter and everything. They give kind of, for trip planning, they give a great overall perspective of where could we go, what do things look like, and being able to kind of look at a good sense of the distances. It's the 4 primary tools that we have when we're thinking of what's the route. Talked about the waterway guide, talked about the chart. There's also the NOAA distance for port booklet. You can see this online. This is a really great resource for being able to get the range from port to port. Another tool is the Garmin Active Captain community, where you're able to look at a broader section of map where you can do also measurement with the measurement tool between a point like Fort Pierce to Weston in the Bahamas. You'd pick the measurement tool and then move to the location you're trying to measure distance to get those broad strokes of planning a trip of how far do you want to go, what's it like in this broader distance. So the 4 tools that we'll look at is our big charts, our waterway guide, if we have that, the Active Captain app, and then the NOAA distance charts, which are also in the waterway guide, but they're available free. Step 3, you know your boat, you know the basic route that you want to go to. Step 3 is deciding on your anchorages and marinas. Where are you going to go each night? Where do you want to spend your time? How many nights do you want to be anchored out? How many nights do you want to be in a marina? How many nights do you want to be on a dock or on a mooring ball? Thinking through those, it's a budget decision, it's a personal decision. Do you want to go out to eat? Do you want to cook on board? All of those things are going to be leading to kind of the full plan. But you got this basic route. Where do you want to go? You want to figure out, are you going to be in a marina or anchor out? For a short trip, we like to make reservations. We like to have a plan, kind of put it all together, even though that plan may change. The weather may change. We might not be able to do it, but we like the frame of the trip. And I personally like to have the reservations in marinas if I can, because I get anxious if I'm trying to make them the same day. So the cruising guides are a great resource, as well as Active Captain. When I'm thinking of both marinas and anchorages, those are the 2 places that I'm going to look. I'm going to look at Active Captain. You can blow this up. You can look at kind of the symbols. Some of these are marinas. some of these are anchorages. So looking at this in St. Augustine, you can see we can anchor out in some spots. You can see there's marinas, and it just gives you the idea of other people have been there. You also can do some great research in the Waterway Guide, which really gives some great explanations of the holding, of what the approaches can be for anchorages, as well as tips on what marinas may be like in terms of their facilities, in terms of what it's like to dock at them. So those are the resources that are going to really kind of help us hone in on where we want to go. Another key when it comes to the anchorages and marinas is, what's your refueling plan? Is it refueling for cooking? Do you need to refuel during the day to extend a day? Can you go a couple days without refueling? That's going to be knowing your boat, knowing your range, and planning for those refueling stops. But you want to make sure it's not just where you're going to spend the night, where you're going to get fuel along the way, plan that out. We really I don't necessarily plan every spot I'm going to get fuel. We tend to, if we're going into a marina, we build our trips so we may anchor out, but it's a shorter distance, and we're going to end at a marina the next day and fuel the next day. So we don't have to kind of fuel in between on a trip that we know is kind of more confined for the day. Now, for marinas, we tend to look first on some of the apps like Docwa and Snag-a-Slip. So they both kind of have limited options. They don't have every place where you can search and find marinas all over. But I like the ability to just book online if I can on an app and look at multiple ones rather than research. So that's where my bias is, looking at Docwa or Snag-a-Slip. Although they're limited options, they're always frustrating. But some places we found that there are great options, so that's where we look first. Now, the second one we're going to look in the Waterway Guide. The Waterway Guide just provides a lot of information about marinas and options in a given location. We're going to look at Active Captain. Active Captain will normally look at some of the reviews. We try and take them always with a grain of salt. Someone may have had a terrible experience. We look at the totality of them, and then we'll look on the internet for the booking at that point. We normally don't book straight through when we're looking at Active Captain. It's going to be looking online. So a lot of times we end up having to call. My preference always, though, is if I can book online, because it just makes it more seamless for me. Step 4. Step 4 is preparing your boat for anchoring and for docking. When you're staying at anchor, you're going to need to make sure you have all the necessary equipment, like your anchor, your chain, your rod. You'll also want to make sure you have a dinghy to get to shore if you're anchoring out, or at least have a small enough boat to get into shore if that's what you're wanting to do. Now, we're assuming that you've kind of tested your anchor, you know your equipment. That's part of the knowing the boat before the trip. We always have a spare anchor with us when we go on a trip in case something happens. So our main anchor is about 30 pounds, and we have 250 foot of chain and line with that. And then our secondary anchor, which is a fortress anchor, it has about 15 feet or 4 meters of chain, and then 150 feet long. So I think it's 46 meters, about 46 meters of line. So we have those two options to hold the boat. We also use the fortress anchor, even though it's pretty big for the dinghy. It gives us the option with the dinghy. Now, staying in the marina, you want to have your reservations ahead of time. And sometimes I'll pick marinas based on the information in Active Captain or in the Waterway Guide. In terms of trying to judge, is there going to be a current that you have to deal with? Do you only want to come in at high tide, low tide? There's going to be notes on that in one of those places often to help you make a decision of what's one marina versus another. Sometimes we'll go to a marina because there's a restaurant. Sometimes we choose a marina because there's shopping nearby. So the factors on the trip are, what do you plan on eating out? Where are you going to provision? Those are all going to be factors in where we make decisions on where we're going to stay. Also, going into a new marina, you want to make sure you have your fenders in place. When you have your slip, you want to look at their map to understand, kind of make that plan ahead of time. How are you going to dock in a new marina? Are you going to go bow in? Are you going to go stern in? Our boat, it's much easier to get on and off on the starboard side, so we prefer to go starboard too. So that's going to decide whether we go bow in or stern in most of the time, is what's the pier situation. But you want to be prepared for that. You want to think it through. It's funny to me because every time I go to a new marina, I feel like the slip is smaller the first time I go in. Every new slip feels smaller the first time I go in, and then they get bigger and bigger as you go into the same slip. But it's going to be mentally prepared to go. You're going into a new slip. you want to think about how does your boat handle and what are the conditions that you can know ahead of time, so you can take kind of the guesswork or last minute decisions or as you're coming in off the table. Step 5, it's plan the meals and what are your provisions going to be. You're going to want to make sure you have enough food and water on board, kind of the basic provisions. And when you think about how long your trip's going to be, how much storage do you have? Can you go 3 days without having to shop or get food? Can you go 5 days? That's going to be based on your boat, your preference, what you enjoy doing. We really like a mix of cooking on the boat some and going out to dinner some. So we always kind of build in a mix of both. We normally have breakfasts on board because it's easy. We like our coffee and just sit and relax. That's our preference. Some people love to go get a breakfast out if they're in the marina. Lunches for us are dictated by kind of what we're doing during the day. We love to go to lunch by boat. It's one of our favorite things. Going to a restaurant that has a dock is always enjoyable. Sometimes if we're going a longer day, you're going to have that provisioned out. And then for us, the boat cooking becomes a really great part of every trip. I feel like meals are better on board a boat. So it kind of, we're kind of halfway through these steps, but if you could, in the comments, we got the question of the day. Let us know what your favorite meal is on a boat, because we're always looking for new meals, new things to cook that are good, easy to prepare, and really enjoyable to have on board, flavorful, and can be made in kind of the limited galleys that we have on board boats. So two pans, what can you do with that? That's our case here. Sometimes it's one pan, but what's a great boat meal? Leave it in the comments. We'd love to hear what your favorite boat meals are. So let's stick around for the last 5 steps kind of in this trip planning process to help launch you on to success. If you find value in any of our content, please subscribe, leave a comment if you'd like. Our videos really come from our subscribers asking questions. We've got a community of people that are interested in boating, having fun, and we want to be really approachable and figuring out how can we enjoy this and have fun. Step 6, safety equipment. That's life jackets, that's flares. Check the expiration on flares and your fire extinguishers. You're going to want to have a safety line. You're going to want to have a throw to make sure you have the kind of the basics covered, and have checked to make CO2, the dates, CO2 cartridges, and expiration on the flares. If you're going offshore, or in our case, if we're going over to the Bahamas, there's another set of safety equipment we always like to make sure we have on board. We have an EPIRB, which is a Type 2 EPIRB. In case something happened on board, we want to be able to have that so people know where we are. We also keep a satellite communication, so we have some communications if we're out of VHF range when we're further offshore. We don't have a life raft on board. We do have our dinghy anytime we're crossing. We have that inflated, although we don't have the engine installed when we're doing that. And we also have a go bag if we needed, if there were a problem on the boat that has that satellite communication, an extra handheld VHF, some water, that we keep that ready in case we need it, and flares. So all that's together if we need it in our kind of go bag that we keep ready to go. But we check that, stock that when we're going offshore. Not necessarily every day, frankly, but it's when we're going to be further off, we want to make sure all that equipment's tested and ready to go. Step 7 is prepare your paperwork. You always want to have it on board. You want to have your insurance. Marinas often require it. You want to have proof of insurance. You want to have your proof of ownership so that you have the documentation if you need it. You always want to have your insurance company's contact information with you. Now, if you're going on a trip that's going outside the country, there's going to be a set of requirements for legal documents, the boat ownership, that you also want to make sure you have. So that think through what's the documentation that you're going to need, and think twice if you're going outside the country to make sure you don't have your trip kind of stymied from not having a piece of paper that is easy to have on board. So we try and make sure we have all those lined up beforehand. If we're going outside the country, we go through the checklist with the country we're going to make sure we're covered when we're going out. Step 8, check the weather. You can look obviously at the short term and the long term. There can be the weather is something you can't plan for, so you can start planning a trip ahead of time. You have the best intentions, and weather stymies it. One of the challenges with a trip that's a defined schedule, that kind of 7 to 10 days, is the weather may completely change the second half of your trip, and you just be kind of prepared to roll with it. You've done the research, you know the range of your boat, you have the best intentions, but let the weather dictate it. Keep safe and figure out what's the best option when something changes. We always keep games on board if it's in case it's a rainy day, and we always have our books on board to kind of lay out and read in our favorite spot up in the salon. The example for us on the 1095. If we're going from Fernandina Beach in North Florida and want to go to Fort Pierce, it's over 200 miles. And then if we're going to cross to the Bahamas, that's going to be another 90 miles from there. So we want to have particularly good weather if we're crossing for that 90 miles. A north wind makes crossing to the Bahamas really difficult, really rough, and really can just throw off your plans, and it can blow for several days. Now the weather, because you can look several days ahead, you may just adjust a couple legs of the trip. It may be one day, or it may be you have to kind of really move the trip around. But that's both the challenge and the beauty of these shorter kind of 7-10 day trips is we've got a defined period of time. We're trying to figure out how to use that time to best of our ability. When we have a good plan, we have the provisions, we can adapt easily, and the weather's the thing that often makes us adapt the most. Step 9 is planning for an emergency. You want to share your float plan with someone who's going to be responsible, and the float plan should include the name of the boat, description of the boat, name of the people on board. You want to share that information with someone that's going to keep track of where you are, and you want to check in with them every day to let them know the progress, and make sure that they're going to reach out if they don't hear from you for 24 hours. They know that they're going to notify the appropriate authorities based on where you were heading or where you've been. So keeping in contact with someone outside is just it's a safety measure. You want your safety equipment on board, but it's kind of prepare for what's the problem. We also on board we keep spares and repair equipment. We have plugs for every one of our through hull fittings. We have 4 through hull fittings that are below the water. We've got one plug for each one of those. We keep extra fuel filters on our boat in case there's a problem with fuel. We keep a long extra fuel line so we could swap between tanks. We keep one extra prop on board so that if 2 props go, we have at least one spare prop on board. Everyone's going to be kind of different in what they're comfortable having on board, but think through what if there's a problem and what are the problems that you can fix. For us, it's the impellers on the generator. It's the fuel filters are the most common things that we've found that when we're traveling. So we make sure those we have spares of those. I always have the fear of the through hull fitting failing, so that's why we have the plugs for those always. But that's just my idiosyncrasies. Think of your idiosyncrasies because you're going to feel more comfortable when you plan for the problems. You're not going to be able to plan for everyone, but plan for some of those so that you can have a more enjoyable trip. If something does happen, you fix it, you move on, and you figure out how to keep enjoying the time on the water. So step 10 is enjoy your trip. That's really the whole goal of this, is to build up to having fun. And the more you prepare, the easier it is to have a great time. And the easier it is to have a great time when something goes wrong. Whether it's the weather, whether it's a mechanical, whether a reservation gets canceled. Having that flexibility built in really comes from having the plan. The more you plan, the more you're able to deal with the things that aren't planned. If you want to learn more about travel tips and tricks, we've got a playlist here of some of the other videos that we've done about tips, trips, and trip planning. So check that out, kind of what we've learned. If you have gotten any value from this, subscribe, ask us questions in the comments, and we'd love to kind of keep building the community. Hope to see you on the water. Remember, have fun, be safe, be happy.